All right, welcome back to part two of our breezing through the AP Gov curriculum. And in Unit 4 now, this is going to be dealing specifically with political socialization, where it's going to argue that there are certain influences that are going to mold your political opinion. And remember, as you get older, that opinion is going to become more firmer in terms of which direction you're going to be. So if you're 15, 16 years old, what political orientation you are now could certainly change by the time that you're 40 or 50 years old based on life experiences, your generation. But the biggest impact, of course, is going to be on the family. And now when we look at polls that are going to be monitoring this, you have opinion polls, you have tracking polls, entrance, exit polls, which are all utilized. And these help to inform politicians about the pulse of Americans. Whether or not they act on that is a whole other story. But nevertheless, you only need a sample size of about 2,000 people to really, in scientific ways, determine the actual thinking of Americans, or any population that is. So by utilizing random sampling techniques and having a sample size of over 2,000, as long as everybody has an equal chance to participate, that can certainly detect the pulse. Now, when it comes to political socialization, whether you're going to wind up on the left with the Democrats, the right with the Republicans, or libertarians, these are typically issues that you're going to espouse. So again, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats. And then you have this other ideology, libertarianism, where you want no intervention by the government at all, or to a very, very minimal amount. So you want things like economic freedom. You want as much personal freedom as possible, ending corporate welfare, definitely being a big champion of the right to bear arms. Where they differ with the Republicans is Republicans support, for example, the Patriot Act, support more laws that regulate morality, certainly like the idea of nation building a little bit more, having a bigger defense budget. Whereas Democrats, liberals, or leftists, however you want to describe them, they want the government regulating the economy. They want more regulation. They're big for international cooperation with the United Nations. They're typically wanting more regulations on guns. And certainly a big supporter of separation of church and state, as well as civil liberties, especially when it comes to privacy. So again, be familiar with these differences, as that is very, very important to know. Now, another important thing to be aware of is fiscal policy. That is going to be a topic that you might see on the AP Gov exam. And Republicans and libertarians typically like to support supply-side economics. And this is when the government is really doing a more hands-off type of approach, like laissez-faire, if you will, where they're reducing taxes, they're removing regulations that they see as burdensome to businesses and to individuals. So they think that's the best way to stimulate the economy. Versus Keynesian economics, which starts with FDR around the Great Depression, is the idea that the government should be utilizing taxes and should be spending through government programs. So think about during the Great Depression with FDR, you had the CCC, you had the TVA, you had the AAA, you had all these different programs, and he thought that would be a good way to stimulate the economy and to sort of control the economic recessions that sometimes happen. So if you are a liberal, you typically are more in favor of Keynesian economics, versus Republicans support supply-side economics. All right, let's move on to Unit 5, and that deals with voting. And keep in mind that when we're looking at voting rates, they tend to be the highest during the presidential elections, tend to be much lower on off-year elections, especially midterm elections. And one reason why we see varying voting rates, depending on the demographic, is going to be based on the number of barriers. The fact that you even have to register to vote is considered a barrier. You might think it's a necessary barrier, which is very legitimate, but nevertheless, it is considered a barrier. Now, other states have enacted voter ID laws and other measures that they claim to make sure that there's more integrity behind the vote. Democrats and liberals are going to see that as sort of voter suppression, especially of minorities, and you can look on my YouTube channel if you want more specifics on that. So one big effort was to expand the number of people signed up to vote, and that was done through the National Registration Act, known as the Motor Voter Law. Now, what's good about that is it's going to register way more people at the DMV when they get their license or they have any business there. The drawback is it doesn't really increase the number of voters. It has a very small, questionable effect. Certainly, it increases registration rates, but the number of people actually coming out to vote actually isn't that high. So we typically see people who are older voting more, as opposed to younger people. All right, now when we go into political parties, they are what you call a linkage institution. They are connecting people with the policy. They have a variety of different functions, from educating voters, they are recruiting candidates, they are funding candidates, they are what you call policy generalists, right? They have a policy basically on every type of matter, from domestic to foreign affairs to social welfare programs. And certainly they're going to have a stance there. Now, political parties have become much more candidate-centered over time. There's less reliance on the political parties, so they have lost a lot of their grip over time. As we see, really, you don't necessarily need the full backing of the political party to win an election. You can go rogue without the full support of your political party, because they are playing less and less of a role. And with interest groups, they focus on one particular issue. They are a policy specialist. They're specializing in one area, unlike a political party, which has many areas that it's going to interject its stance upon. Now, they are going to educate voters. They are also going to be part of the Iron Triangle, which makes it very difficult for outside influences to influence policy, because this triangle is so iron tight, if you will, very difficult to penetrate, right? So with an Iron Triangle that's made up of the interest group, that's made up of the congressional committee, and that's made up of the bureaucracy, bureaucratic agency, that is. Now, some say that the Iron Triangle is too simplistic, and they subscribe to the idea of the issue network, which has way more players than just 3 in the Iron Triangle. I mean, you could have hundreds, and you see alliances form between interest groups and whatnot. But the big idea of the Iron Triangle, why it's so ironclad, is you scratch my back, I scratch your back amongst the 3 parts of this triangle, that they're all sort of supporting the same policy, and they're not letting anything or anyone else in. Certainly, the effectiveness of an interest group is going to be affected by the amount of resources. So the more money you have, if you have good lobbyists, the more access to congressmen and women, that's going to make your interest probably a little bit more important than, let's say, an interest group that does not have all those resources. Another linkage institution is elections, right? You have people being connected to the policy by voting in particular representatives. And some states have caucuses, or caucus, I don't know if that's the correct word, but nevertheless, Iowa is one of the more known ones, and that's sort of that very community-based type of way of determining, which candidate you're going to go. So you have them in high school gymnasiums, for example. But most states have what you call a primary, where you go in June, or whenever your date is before the general election, and through a ballot, you're selecting the candidate for that party. Now, you have closed primaries, which say you have to be registered with that political party to vote. You have open, which says you can choose, but you can't do both political parties. You don't have to be registered, you just have to pick one. Or you can do blanket, which is very rare, where they allow you to basically vote in both primaries, and you don't even have to be registered. But most are leaning towards closed or open. Now, one thing about elections, certainly they are becoming much more expensive, especially for presidential elections, as well as just national elections in general. Certainly, House elections are not going to be as expensive as Senate elections, and Senate elections are not going to be expensive as national presidential elections. So certainly getting a lot more money because of PACs and super PACs, a lot of money going in here. So with Citizens United v. FEC, a required case, it's going to utilize the First Amendment that says unlimited spending by corporations is allowed. And this is going to overturn the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, otherwise known as the McCain-Feingold Act, which had set a number of restrictions, saying, capping the amount of hard money and soft money that could be donated. And that's going to be overturned, particularly the part about banning soft money. Now corporations can send unlimited amounts to what's going to be eventually super PACs. So this is going to gut most of this particular part on the basis that corporations are entitled to free speech through campaign donations as per the First Amendment. But this is going to open up the floodgates immensely to corporations having more influence on elections. All right, and then we have the media. Certainly they have a number of functions here, from being an entertainment type of thing to watchdog, keeping the branches of our government honest, along with our politicians, scorekeeper, goalkeeper, what are they going to allow in? And then, of course, you have media bias, which is going to happen, and that's going to depend based on your preference. People tend to gravitate towards sources that they agree with more politically politically speaking, in terms of their ideology. So if you're more right, leaning, you might watch Fox News. If you're more left leaning, you might be more inclined to watch MSNBC. But again, that comes into play. But the biggest part here about the media is the agenda setter. They are setting what people are talking about, right? They can only select so many stories to talk about in 60 minutes or, each day. And as a result, they are setting the agenda as to what is controversial, what is important. And in that role, it's very, very important. So the media is an linkage institution, sometimes called the fourth branch of government. So in closing, it is very important to note all these major documents, cases, and amendments. I've tried to hit on these in part 1, tried to also hit on these in part 1 and a little bit in part 2 today, and then also knowing the amendments. I do have separate videos that are posted in the links below that will go off on each one. So certainly check that if you have any or want any more further clarification. And again, that was my attempt to do the entire AP Gov curriculum in a very hastily manner, but hopefully this helped you to some degree.